This afternoon session with high-ranking speakers, and we have to catch up also with the morning work, because one speaker still has to present here his paper. Professor Stefan Oether already was presented by the morning chair, so I think he doesn't need further presentation. Professor in Hamburg for public law, public international law, European law, and a great expert in various fields of international law, for example, also in the field of migration, asylum and refugee law. Please, Stefan, yours the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm really sorry that I missed most of the morning session. Was a bit of misfortune. I had to participate in a thesis defense in Rotterdam online, which I had agreed to the date much before I was invited here to the conference, and the defense took much longer than expected. They are quite cumbersome and complex in the Netherlands, and so I came only when you were in the discussion. What I'm going to present is a legal policy analysis. Let's say my topic is the Dublin system. Or could you? There were the slides. My topic is the Dublin system, and I will partly present the kind of the intricacies, you could also say the pitfalls of the current state of the Dublin system, which I think has partly progressed too rapidly, and states got afraid of what is happening in there. Now it's stuck halfway in between somewhere, where I think in a state where it's not sustainable in the long run, and we'll have to see where it goes, and I will kind of try to map a bit the major inherent contradictions the current state of the system has. I cannot give a clear perspective on where it is going, because I think there are two kind of potential scenarios which are going at opposite directions. Okay, yeah, that's okay. So for the introduction, the kind of the analysis of the prolonged crisis of the common European asylum system with the Dublin arrangement at its core is a kind of is nearly trivial. A lot of people have observed that. And at the same time, we clearly have a political blockade in the reform discussion. It's kind of endless loop of reform attempts which are leading nowhere. Since I've here written 10 years, but it's more or less since 15 years, and there's still no sign. There are still no signs of a developing political agreement of how to go forward. My Constance colleague Daniel Thiem has formulated that in very harsh words in a recent publication, where also some others present here have participated, in the sentence, the signs of malfunctioning and occasional failure are palpable. And we have a number of illustrations for that finding. The situation at the external borders, which are becoming in more and more points problematic, endless disputes about secondary movements, and the miserable reception conditions for asylum seekers in some hotspots, in particular on some of the Greek islands. But these are only kind of tips of the iceberg. And the dysfunctionalities of the Dublin system are highlighted by a number of mediatized scandals. Think of Moria, and which has become a notorious case, but behind which is hidden a number of other hotspots with insufficient reception conditions on Greek islands, which doesn't say that hotspots and reception centers are much better in other parts of Europe at the external borders. We have the notorious failure of the take-back procedure under the Dublin regulation with its kind of ensuing transfer of jurisdiction. And we have all these reports of pushbacks which are growing and growing and growing, and which at least parts of them the European Court of Human Rights sanctioned in a way the practice of what you could call pushbacks in Ceuta and Melilla at the enclaves in Morocco, but I would say a number of the other pushbacks are clearly illegal under, in particular, the European Convention on Human Rights. And if one looks a bit more in detail, I would say if these were kind of isolated incidents growing in number, this would still be a point of concern, but I think what is a point of concern much more that it's in a way systemic. It's an outflow of inherent contradictions of the system as it stands at the moment. The political bottleneck is the solidarity issue, which kind of fails to be solved with an agreement, every attempt of reform after the other. And at the core, the question of relocations, and the Commission with its idea of a mandatory relocation scheme based on national quotas, it's a no-go since 15 years. The Commission in endless loops tries it again and fails again in political negotiations. And one could say, I've here written resistance in particular of Eastern European states, but observers have remarked, well, that's again only a kind of tip of the iceberg. Probably the majority of the governments in the European Union is not in favor of that model. In particular, isn't there a number of states who are not first entry states, which receive very little numbers of refugees and migrants, and which have no interest in higher relocation quotas. So it's in political terms, it doesn't lead to anything. The result of that, we are stuck with the notorious first entry rule, which was, I'll come back a bit later on that, which was a kind of initial formula compromise. We know that this might lead to a catastrophic overburdening of first entry countries, and that the states knew that. We can see in the Ukraine crisis, where they suddenly activated, you could say, the zombie of the temporary protection doctrine, where 2-3 years ago everybody wrote, well, that's dead letter, it will never be made use of. The states knew it will end up in an unmanageable situation if we don't find a solution, and so they circumvented the problem of the missing relocation scheme by activating suddenly the temporary protection directive, which in a way is friendly for the people coming over the border, because it leaves them the choice where to go. And so from a perspective of the individuals, it's a much more positive arrangement than the Commission's mandatory relocation idea, which we have a bit the same system in Germany with the so-called Königsteiner Schlüssel, where we distribute migrants between the Länder, which also leads to a lot of frictions between a lot of the refugees, migrants end up in places where they don't like to be. So we also have internally a lot of problems with secondary movements because they don't remain in the places where they are allocated. We have a problem with the reception conditions, huge discrepancies in reception conditions, in particular concerning housing and social transfers. It would be too easy to say that this is the reason of the secondary movements, because it's quite clear at least as much a role play economic strength, labor market conditions where you have hope of building up an existence, the existence of ethnic networks which are concentrated in bigger urban areas, in particular in Central and Northern Europe, and family ties in a wider sense, not in the narrow sense of the European regulations. And all that are factors which induce people who have arrived in the first entry countries to move further to the countries where they want to be. And such secondary movements clearly lead to anger of northern member states who are mostly the target states. And in essence, one must say there's no working mechanism to cope with such movements, because the take-back procedure, which was written into the Dublin kind of regulations. This doesn't really work, with the result that of the transfer of jurisdiction. In a way, we have a relocation mechanism, but which is a kind of, in a way, an anarchic kind of organic relocation mechanism, which again produces distributional imbalances at another place than a rigid first entry rule would produce. And since reform on all that is largely blocked, what is happening is that the focus of reform discussions is largely put on tighter border controls and on higher rates of return. But progress in these matters is slow despite the dynamic, and that's even described dynamic, the build-up of Frontex, which has had a kind of explosion of resources and manpower in the last years. But it doesn't really solve the problem, and the pushbacks, I think, are a result of that unresolved situation that states no, let's say, everybody we let into the country return won't function, so we try by sheer force, brute force, to prevent them entering the country. And we have the trend towards externalization. Think of the recent messages on the British arrangement with Rwanda, and think of the Danish prison in Kosovo, which was another of these interesting arrangements of externalization. So I think that should suffice to point to the need of reform. Just a very brief sketch of the loops of attempted and failed reforms. One could say in the first phase, the European Council was the driver of the project of the common European asylum system, starting with the famous Tampere conclusions from 1999. From 1999. There was a pattern of 5-year programs driving forward the establishment and consolidation of the area of freedom, security, and justice. We had the Hague program of 2005, the Stockholm program of 2010. In 2015, this ended. It was clear one would not be able to agree on the next 5-year program. Initiative shifted to the Commission. The Commission kind of presented its kind of notorious famous 2015 agenda for migration, which didn't lead to anything. And the deep divisions among member states, it's not only north-south, east-west, and there are also other divisions, became quite visible. And the Commission in 2020 made the Council made an initiative to relaunch long-term political guidelines. There were discussions on draft guidelines at technical level in Council working groups. It never reached the plenary of the Council, so it's, I would say, it's a failure. And my intuition is that the Commission's kind of, with high words, praised new pact on migration and asylum will kind of find the same fate as the other attempts. Negotiations are still going on, but I don't think that there's reason for great optimism that the package will be consented by member states soon. So, just a brief look to the major issues, starting again with the solidarity issue and this thorny issue of mandatory relocation. As I said, the first entry rule was an initial formula compromise in the absence of a consensus on something else. We know that, and Ukraine with our temporary relocation directive is a good example for that it would end up in catastrophic situations of distributional imbalance, which would not be manageable anymore. This has not happened because the assumption on which these catastrophic scenarios rest are false in a way, and the assumption is that the migrants would stay in the country of first entry, what the European legislation in a way provides for them, but they are not doing that. They are ignoring it with the secondary movements, with a completely different distributional balance coming up as a result of these of these kind of non-planned individual relocations. I've already mentioned we have endless loops of, in particular, the Commission struggling for mandatory relocation schemes with a very strong resistance of the member states. Again, Daniel Thiem in the same publication wrote of pointed to that there is little appetite for wide-scale relocations in capitals across Europe, not only in Eastern Europe, which are often cited as the notorious cases. And I would also say it's not highly probable that country states will agree on the mandatory relocation mechanism based on a quota scheme. There's some degree of voluntary relocation, but only in smaller portions of the entire amount of relocation needs. The Commission now in the new pact proposal proposes to complement that with a new instrument of return sponsorships, which will lead to some degree of relocation as well, because after if states are not states are not managing to handle return in a given time frame, jurisdiction shifts to them. They have to take the return candidates. I'm not sure that this isn't a politically acceptable proposal. So I mean, it's one of the new fantasy ideas of the Commission, which probably will experience the same fate as most of the other ones. Reception conditions. There I see also a big problem. We know we have huge discrepancies in reception conditions. The EU institutions are clearly aware of the problem. I found a quite interesting press statement linked to the new pact of 2020, where the Commission was writing that the 2016 proposal for a recast of the Asylum Reception Conditions Directive, I cite, will ensure asylum seekers are received under harmonized and decent conditions throughout the EU. It will help prevent unauthorized movements within the EU by clarifying the rights and obligations of asylum seekers. This is largely PR speech, because if you analyze in detail the proposed mechanisms, the proposed recast, you realize it won't change that much. There might be some basic level of a dignified standard of treatment, as the Commission calls it, but huge discrepancies in material standards of housing, living, but also in social welfare payments will remain. And I think it cannot be else, because the discrepancies in social welfare levels in Europe are so big that real harmonization is impossible, because there's always a coupling to the social welfare levels at a local, national level, and you cannot, let's say, you cannot create a harmonized level somewhere which would be far above levels in countries like Bulgaria, and probably far too low for countries like Denmark, Sweden, Germany. That's not going to work, with the result that the discrepancies will remain. Secondary movements will remain to a large degree, and the take-back procedure, the problems with the take-back procedure, that the Commission is also trying to kind of work very much in detail on bits and pieces of that, streamlining take-back procedures, creating measures of sanctioning disrespect for EU law by asylum seekers, how they call it. I think these are, in a way, tiny details. They will not change the situation. And I think what shows a bit the desperation of the Commission is that the Commission proposes in the new pact also an amendment of the Schengen Borders Code with a novel mechanism for refusal of entry at the internal borders and the direct transfer of the kind of candidates for refusal of entry to the neighboring countries, which gives an incentive for propping up border controls at the internal borders in a way kind of is eroding the Schengen acquis. So I think it shows a bit the desperation. Yeah, I'm speeding up. My last substantial point, border controls and return procedures. I've already said there's a shift to these border controls and return procedures. The core of the Commission proposals in the new pact is the introduction of a so-called pre-entry screening, which means a kind of pre-procedure at the border. People substantially have entered the territory, but there's a fiction of non-entry. They are not authorized really to enter the country, and then there should be a screening designed to prepare further decision-making with the options: start a formal asylum procedure, refusal of entry in line with the Schengen Borders Code, or an immediate return decision in accordance with the return directive. The problem with that is that sounds, let's say, if you are interested in efficient border controls, sounds all nice. The success of all that really depends on cooperation of third countries, but because it doesn't help if you refuse entry at the Belarus border and Belarus doesn't take the people back. It's a formal decision with no real result, and the same is with return decisions which cannot be implemented if you have no cooperation of the third countries concerned. And in addition, the committee is not very courageous in that it largely silences on the implications of it, because if you take it seriously, it means severe restrictions of mobility, even detentions, which is not spoken out in the proposal. And it raises the general problem of hotspots, how to guarantee decent conditions and an acceptable level of legal protection, including access to courts. Nobody knows exactly how to guarantee that, really, if you have a streamlined procedure and a kind of detention type hotspot for the screening procedure. I think it will not improve drastically the efficiency of border measures. Well, I skip the next part and only would like to point to the same problem, more or less, with the speeding up, streamlining of return procedures. Also there we have the problem, even if we involve on a bigger scale Frontex, like in the other case, the new European Agency on Asylum, it would raise a huge question of changes in the court architecture of the European Union, because we would need a network of specialized tribunals of handling these issues. And it's not that sure that it will really lead to a big improvement. It again depends very much on cooperation of third states. And then with my conclusions, as I tried to demonstrate, the Dublin arrangement, and in a wider sense the common European asylum system, they are fraught with enormous perils and pitfalls. The reaction quite often heard is the status quo might be better than a bad reform, but I doubt that this is true, because I think the status quo is not sustainable in the long run. At the moment, most states can live with the status quo, but the price is high, because it leads to a growing erosion of legality, practices that are far away from the legal setup, with the danger of gradual disintegration of the common European asylum system, and member states taking European legislation less and less seriously. The signs are already visible. And again, a short citation of Daniel Thiem, who writes, without a legislative reform which works reasonably well in practice, the European asylum system might go down the drain, and we see already the signs of that. President Macron, and not recently, already quite some time ago, has more or less remarked, so at the margins, well, whether we can sustain Schengen, the Schengen arrangement is not that sure. So I think if we don't come to a kind of adequate reform of the, however that might look like, adequate reform of the Dublin system, there's a danger for the survival of the Schengen system, and these are the two perspectives. Either we make a kind of progress which makes the system sustainable, or the other perspective will be that we get stuck with the system, with the status quo as we are. But I think that will mean building back the Schengen system to a scheme of variable geometry as it started before it was becoming part of the supranational arrangement at the Lisbon Treaty. So much for my a bit grim outlook on the Schengen system, Dublin system.
Very many thanks, Professor Reuter. Many thanks, Professor Reuter, for this very clear presentation. I think this shows that this is a really unsatisfactory, incomplete package, and probably this whole topic will remain on the table also for the foreseeable future. But now we have got a stock taking, which I think was really clear and impressive. And we will continue directly with Professor Christian Tomoschat. Professor Christian Tomoschat needs no presentation, but a few words. He's Professor Emeritus at the Humboldt University of Berlin. He's been a member of the UN Human Rights Committee and the International Law Commission, and its president in 1992. He's a highly decorated academic and surely one of the most renowned German international lawyers. As we all know, he's a highly prolific writer. His book, Human Rights Between Idealism and Realism, is in the third edition with Oxford University Press, and it is probably one of the most cited textbooks on human rights worldwide. So we are very glad to have you here, Professor Tomoschat. Yours the floor.
Thank you, Chairman. Cari colleghi e amici, qui dovremmo parlare italiano, ma non è possibile perché vogliamo comunicare con tutti. Allora, let's switch to English, which is the common language now in Europe. And my short speech will try to present a few empirical episodes of migration law which are still relevant in our time. I will give a short introduction, and afterwards I shall evoke those precedents from the German history which may still be relevant today. Now, my introduction, nobody here needs to be taught a lesson. Migration is not a situation of stability. It describes a process fraught with fear and apprehensions that should end as quickly as possible. No population wishes to be constantly on the run. Migrants are people who have left their country of origin on the most diverse grounds, attempting to find a place somewhere else where they can lead a life in security, shielded against threats of death and misery. Two main problems arise for every migrant. Can they find a country willing to receive them? This is problem number one. And will the conditions at such a place of reception permit them to unfold their capacities to provide for their own livelihood? Migrants are not beggars. They wish to live and work as members of a community in which they are protected, but to which they can also make a valuable contribution. Germany lies at the heart of Europe. Well known, of course. This geopolitical fact has over the centuries entailed a variety of consequences for its population. Migratory movements have succeeded one another, sometimes at short intervals, in addition to the steady flow of individuals across borders. Nonetheless, since it appeared in 1871 as a nation-state comparable to its peers in Europe, Germany has never adopted a deliberate migration policy for persons seeking to be permanently admitted in its territory. Germany's constitution, its basic law of 1949, contented itself with laying down in its Article 16 a right of asylum in favor of persons persecuted on political grounds, following in this respect the 1951 Geneva Convention relating to the status of refugees, but departing decisively from this convention by setting forth an individual right that is enforceable by judicial remedies. This was a unique gesture intended to express the gratitude of the German people to the assistance provided, in particular to the German citizens of Jewish origin who during the criminal Nazi dictatorship from 1933 to 1945 had found protective refuge in other countries. Germany wanted to pay back to other peoples persecuted on political grounds some elements of the debt it had accumulated vis-à-vis the host countries that had taken care of its countrymen and countrywomen during the abhorrent years. The consecration of the right of asylum was designed to show at the same time that Germany conceived of itself henceforth as a democratic state under the rule of law where the rights of the individual would enjoy firm protection. Now I look back to these episodes, some of the episodes, I cannot take them up all, and the first noteworthy development, which still has some relevance today, was triggered by the decision of the King of France in 1685 to revoke the Edict of Nantes that in 1598 had granted a status of safety and equality to French Protestants after the religious wars that followed the Reformation of the 16th century. To leave French territory was the only conceivable solution for people unwilling to revert to the Catholic faith in order to evade the threat of death. The monarch of Brandenburg, Elector Friedrich Wilhelm, saw the French expulsion measures as a welcome opportunity to repopulate his country that had gravely suffered from the 30 Years' War. Immediately after the French Edict of Revocation, he issued on 29 October 1685 the Edict of Potsdam, first in French, through which he invited the Huguenots to come to Brandenburg, promising them appreciable economic advantages. Accepting this generous offer, around 20,000 refugees moved to Prussia, but a great number of them settled down in Brandenburg, in particular in the city of Berlin. By the way, one of my ancestors was among them. And even in the remote province of East Prussia, close to Lithuania. The new citizens were incorporated in a special colony guaranteeing them a large measure of autonomy for the preservation of their language regarding religious service and education of the children. Berlin thereby enjoyed a tremendous rise in economic and intellectual capacity. It was transformed from an agrarian town to a center of craftsmanship and small industry. In 1700, every fifth Berliner was of French origin. Before the passage of a century, the integration process was completed and the French language disappeared progressively as language of communication. Obviously, the successful implantation of such a great number of new citizens was the fruit of interests that matched easily. The refugees received new homes, and the Brandenburg government could lay the foundations of a modernized state, reaping sizable advantages for their country, not only being motivated by feelings of solidarity and compassion. Thus, the external circumstances promoted a situation that differed fundamentally from the typical representation of a flow of refugees, where the new arrivals would need to be taken care of in a comprehensive fashion. And let me just pass on very fast to a second similar event, when the Archbishop of Salzburg in 1731 expelled all Protestants to leave his territory. The process of expulsion started in 1731, and again Brandenburg saw a good opportunity to receive nice and competent people, and they repopulated the province of Brandenburg and even the faraway East Prussia. Both situations shared many common features. The origin of the exodus lay in religious conflicts and traditional forces attempting to vanquish the new religious movements that had gained ground against the formerly dominant Catholic creed. Eventually, tensions reached such a high degree of intensity that expulsion was chosen by the government authorities as a remedy of last resort. The expellees were received in a country whose monarch also had decided to adhere to the new religious creed. Sizable economic advantages were again provided to the refugees. The two examples just highlighted were not representative for the general climate surrounding people lacking a stable residence. From 1648 to 1806, ordinary citizens were often tied to their land, not entitled to travel freely. Fears of bands of vagrants led to the instauration of strict control mechanisms. Human rights had not yet begun their victorious assault on the repressive aspects of the absolute monarchical rule. I pass on quickly to the Weimar Republic, just telling you that from 1871 to 1918, the newly founded German Reich was very liberal regarding the acceptance of people from the East, from Poland. Many Jews came to Germany, although there was always some resentment against Poles and Jews in particular. The Prussian monarchy had resentments, but this did not really materialize in the policies. Eastern borders were opened, greatly opened, and this greatly enriched Germany, let's say that frankly. And now in the Weimar Republic, after 1919, there was some big event which the new republic had to face up to. This was the Russian Revolution in 1917, and hundreds of thousands of Russians came to Germany, in particular also to Berlin and Brandenburg, and the democratic institutions of the Weimar Republic all of a sudden had to face up to the presence of great numbers of people who had lost income and possessions. No welfare legislation existed for their benefit, and nonetheless Germany accepted the influx of the Russian refugees without erecting any prohibitive barriers. No asylum regime was established for their support. They were not welcomed, they were just admitted having to take care of their own livelihood. Administrative authorities could at any time put an end to their stay in Germany, but no remedies were available against such decisions. According to the available statistical data, Germany became the most important country of reception in Europe. For 1923, the number of Russians staying in Germany was counted at 560,000 persons. That's quite a great number. I'm not going to talk now about Nazi Germany from 1933 to 1945. You all know what happened during those times, and I'm talking about people wishing to come to Germany, not about expulsion and all that. That's a different chapter. Now, receiving refugees after the end of World War II, there was a peculiar situation because, you know, the Potsdam agreements among the Allied powers had decided to divide Germany into different zones and to separate the eastern provinces from Germany and to expel the Germans living there and also the Germans living in neighboring countries. All people of German origin were expelled, driven. It was in the Potsdam Agreement, it said they should be transferred in a humane manner. Frankly, this many times did not happen. They were just expelled, and many of those people, the Germans in the East, were killed. Well, it was a challenge for the two German states, the GDR and the FRG, to receive those people, millions of people who came, and nobody said, we cannot do that, and it's too much. These were Germans, not all of them of German nationality, but many only of German ethnicity. They were expelled because they were ethnic Germans, but they were welcomed. They all received shelter and residence in the GDR and in the FRG. Most of the refugees wanted to go to the western part, the FRG, but many of them also stayed in the German Democratic Republic because they couldn't do it otherwise. Another important element after that was after 1949, when the two states had emerged on the soil of the German Reich. On the one hand, the German Democratic Republic, on the other hand, in the West, the Federal Republic of Germany. And it soon turned out that life was not easy in the German Democratic Republic. People preferred to go to the West, to Cologne, to Freiburg, Frankfurt, Hamburg, and so on. There was a flow of people coming from the GDR. They wanted to live in the West. What did the Germans say? Immediately after 1949 was a basic law was enacted, and this flow of refugees, that was 1951, and the West Germans said, oh, it's terrible, all these people from Eastern Germany, that's too much for us. And they immediately enacted a statute according to which that Germans from the GDR needed a special authorization to move to West Germany. A strange thing. Those were our nationals, they had the same nationality, yeah? And they established a border requiring that people be provided with an authorization to be able to live in the West. The law, of course, was submitted to the Federal Constitutional Court, and the Federal Constitutional Court, you know, in a decision of 1951 said, oh, this law is okay. It is under Article 11, we have a restriction clause in Article 11. This is okay. They didn't even really hint at the fact that this was very serious. That could have led to definitive separation of Eastern Germany from the West. But the constitutional judges were not aware, and I think it's a shameful decision in a way from our constitutional court, the guardian of constitutional rights. That was something which really I do regret that our constitutional court at that time did not realize its responsibility. Then I come to the most important, wave maybe of migration after the founding of the European community. Originally it was the European community of coal and steel. There was not much migration, but it increased after a while. 1958 we had the European Economic Community, and all of a sudden people from 5 other countries could freely travel to Germany. Was there any problem? There was no problem. They French, Italian, they could all come to Germany, travel freely. People found, all these Italians in Germany all of a sudden. But we stayed quiet, nothing was done, and everyone felt that this was done on the basis of reciprocity, you know. That's a very element. The freedom of movement within the European Union was not a unilateral sacrifice, it was on the basis of reciprocity. Italians could come to Germany, they could work at Ford in Cologne, but Germans could freely travel to Ischia and Napoli, you know, on the other hand. So it was a different situation. Thereby, on the basis of reciprocity, you easily accept freedom of movement. 1993, there was an interesting moment again, you know, when all of a sudden the number of asylum seekers rose vehemently, up to more than 500,000 per year, and we did a constitutional amendment, and in this one section of that constitutional amendment, it was stated that people who went fleeing from their country of origin, when they first went to a country where as the right of asylum was guaranteed, they could not apply in Germany for asylum. Yeah? And this was also something where Germany showed quite a lot of flexibility and not sticking firmly to its basic principles, you know, where we yielded and said, well, it's going to be too much. We can't take all these people from foreign countries. There must be some outer limit. And one of the great crisis situation came about in 2015 after in the Middle East. Okay, I'm at the end. This was also the 2015. It caused great trouble in Germany. Chancellor Merkel did accepted those people, maybe against all the rules of our constitutional system, but she did. And it's amazing that now in 2022, even before the EU enacted its new rules, Germany all of a sudden admitted all the Ukrainians, the borders were open to them, and they could make use of all the social and economic services provided by the state. And just 1 minute for me, conclusion. Our short overview of some salient events in German history have shown that immigration may be most welcome where governments accept immigration as a useful addition to their human resources. The two examples provided from the 17th and the 18th century display an ideal situation which will rarely be encountered in real life. For the most part in German's history of the 19th century, when individuals acted on their own without any collective organization, a stable order grew spontaneously even in the absence of governmental intervention. On the other hand, it has become clear that even sophisticated legal migration regimes remain vulnerable to factual pressures from both sides, the pressures exerted by migrants, asylum seekers on the one hand, and the resistance opposed by populations defending their priority rights on the other hand. Management of immigration conflicts can only help to mitigate any emerging conflicts. Where the appropriation and distribution of land comes into issue, the need to preserve the integrity of national identity will be invoked and used as a key argument. This is so in the political debate. Worldwide solidarity is not a natural fact of life. It is incumbent on our generation to develop strategies for action suited to overcome the archaic instincts unleashed by the global climate change. Prevention should have started yesterday already. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Tomoschat. I think this was also a very important presentation because it evidenced how much Europe, the continent of Europe, was always a continent of light, of expulsion, but also of open borders. And most important of all, I think, is the fact that this acceptance of thousands and hundred thousands of people enriched the accepting countries. We have only to remind that after World War II, the so-called economic wonder, the Wirtschaftswunder in Germany, was mainly also architected, was due to the influx of hundred thousands of highly educated Sudeten Germans. The Czech thought that they would now blow the definite hit on the Germans. In reality, Germany was enriched by these groups, and of course the situations change, and Professor Tomoschat also pointed out that solidarity depends on many elements, but we saw that also in history, even in situations without these international frameworks, the Refugee Convention, solidarity was there, and I think this is a very important element from which we can learn also today. Many thanks again, and we will continue directly with a presentation which also goes in this direction because it regards multiculturalism in Europe, in France, and the presentation is made by François Ferral. François Ferral is Professor Emeritus at the University of Perpignan, of which he was president from 2002 to 2007. He's a renowned expert in the field of public law, administrative science, sociology of law and legal theory, but also indigenous rights, multiculturalism, immigration, and legal pluralism. As one of the most foremost experts with regard to multiculturalism within the French society and its legal and sociological implications, we are really proud to have him here and to be allowed to listen to your presentation on the particular situation of France regarding immigration in Europe. You have the floor.
Is it possible to have the slide, please? I command the slide with? So, wonderful. So, thank you very much, Chairman. Sì, è qui. Sono tanto felice di venire qui a Napoli, però se, come lei dice, we must to speak in English. But, and I apologize because my French school English, which it is the worst in the world, I am very sorry for this. So yes, I would like to take advantage of, I am just candid, about the immigration law, to deep the conference of the Professor Attaway. He showed that legal idealism is today the best way to the political realism. I think to me that the question of the legal framework for refugees is a perfect illustration of the dialectical approach to the law by the social production of the rule of law. There are socio-historical conditions that generate this situation in comparison with the state of opinion and socio-political balance of the post-war period. Law appears to us an abstraction, in the word of Albert Camus, dans La Peste, and intellectual construction whose content depends on social force. The rule of natural law that seemed universal to us appears as a relative intellectual construction. It is scandalous what I say. This is what may explain our pessimism and disenchantment. I'm sorry. France has special issue with her border and has also ambiguous representation of foreign people in relation with her history. In the EU context, France illustrating the difficulties of the government in front of the scrap of xenophobia in public opinion. We can seize the new legal policy, a new organization of the reception and control of migrants, the codification of the immigration, the French conception of hospitality have been shaken up on the occasion of the Islamic attack beginning in 1990. Border tension have opposed France to United Kingdom during the management of jungle in Calais. Similarly, media intervention of the border of Spanish Catalonia in the presence of the President of the Republic showed the difference between the practice and the discourse. However, in spite of tension to Italy, a spectacular decision of the French Constitutional Council is emblematic of these ambiguities. The border issue in France, very quickly, France is at the crossroad of Europe and the end of the continent, the north of the Mediterranean. France appears as one of the main crossroads of European migration, but not the more difficult. France in Europe maritime borders, in a part of Atlantic Ocean and Mediterranean Sea, France is in the second lane of immigration flow in Europe. Italy, Spain, Northern and Eastern Europe, and at UE carrefour migration through the country. France is also main border with the United Kingdom under particular condition, le Touquet Treaty. We will speak about this already. The ambiguous French posture in front of foreign people. Because of its history and its social political posture, France maintained ambiguous policies and discourse with regard to immigration and contradictory action to the population victim of the wars of the Middle Orient or sub-Saharan crisis. The importance of population flow in relation to French colonial history, especially coming from Africa, with the Francophonie, Maghreb, sub-Saharan Africa, and overseas France. But also appears the question of the extent of this flow coming from France to this same country. It's especially to do business and maintain the French influence. And French people are very happy to have a visa in all these countries. It is one of the contradictions. An ambivalent stance toward immigration, the tradition of hospitality coming from French Revolution. During the French Revolution was established the principle of open door nationality to foreigner revolution friend. In 1791, the first constitution said any man born and domiciled in France, aged 21 years, any foreigners aged 21 years who, having been domiciled in France for 1 year, live there from work acquire property, or marry a French woman, adopt a child, or feed an old man. Finally, any foreigner who will be judged by the legislative body to have a well-deserved humanity is admitted to the exercise of the right of French citizen. It is beau comme de l'antique. It is the law of the soil, the principal by opposition to the law of the blood, which is still quasi-constitutional principle today. The tradition of hospitality comes with the French Revolution, as example in the article in the Constitution of 1793 Constitution. France gave asylum to foreigners banished for their homeland for the cause of freedom. The principle of total equality of the individual without distinction of nationality, race, or religion, and the first law on abolition of slavery, it was an emblematic fight for the deputy L'Abbé Grégoire. Marvelous principle. But in the same time, noble population was persecuted, indiscriminated, and La Terreur ways was opened in France. It was very difficult for a noble people to come back in France. But France was regular outbreak by xenophobia, reestablishment of slavery by Napoleon, colonization indigenous status during the 19th century, restriction and xenophobia in 1930 and 1938 before the Second World War. During 1880, xenophobia against people coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, social racism against poor workers, Italian, Belgian, German, Spanish, sometimes professional sector, road workers, miners, metallurgists, or sometimes even ethnic group are perceived as such the anti-Gypsy position. In 1931, economic crisis and colonial exposure rise of xenophobia, the anti-Semitism and anti-Polish from of persecuted people by Nazi Reich coming from the East. Today, a new page of xenophobia is in France, a page of xenophobia, and in particular, a rupture between the economic elite open to the globalization and international trade and populist resentment. The Islamist attack of the middle 19th is connected with political crisis in Algeria, marked the beginning of the anti-Muslim xenophobia in France. Crisis aggravated by the Islamic attack in Toulouse, Paris, in Nice, and regular attack in the country. Small attack very often, but attack which have a very important effect of the, in the public opinion. Today, there is a growth of Islamophobia with a particular attention to immigrants of African origin and their family. A double feeling of fear and rejection of otherness. Thus, immigrants are perceived as a threat to the native French identity. Stupid, but it is a sentiment. Dangerous for security, infringing on social rights in competition with French workers. And this xenophobic sentiment is co-opted by the largest class of the political class for electoral reasons. Unfortunately, the representation of the migration issue is only growing in the public opinion in France today. The xenophobic evolution of the legal framework for asylum and immigration. When I say in my introduction that the law is a mirror of the society, I think that we have a good example here. The law and the strengthening of the French administrative apparatus reflect this xenophobic tension that have been manifesting themselves since the beginning of the century. They are also expressed in the political field with electoral nationalism. The strengthening administrative means of reception and control of migrant qualification, work, and the content of two laws in this area deserve to be explored to illustrate this evolution. However, in this cloudy sky, there is just a small sun. A decision of the Constitutional Council appears to be against the tide of this xenophobic evolution, but it is very, very small. The administrative apparatus of refugee flow, which is very important to see, that in the French tradition of administration, we have many means to to not implement the law, to have a manner to not implement the law. OFRA is a public administrative establishment. It was created by the law in 1952 in the application of the Convention of 1951. Is decide on application, and I said in decide, it is an administrative decision on application for asylum and statelessness submitted to it. So we have the National Court of Asylum, which is competent to hear decision of asylum application, is a specialized administrative court, ruling at the last instance of appeals against decision of the French Office for the Protection of Refugees and Stateless Persons, OFPRA. L'OFPRA was initially placed under the administrative supervision of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs until 2007. This public institution then comprised two entities, an administrative entity and a judicial entity, administrative judicial entity, the Refugee Appeals Commission. Since 2010, OFRA has been under the supervision of the Ministry of the Interior, and the evolution is significant. In theory, it is only a financial and administrative supervision, and this supervision will not influence the office independence. The office shall carry out in task impartiality and does not receive in their performance any instruction. That is, says the law. But the supervision is accompanied by the contract of objective and performance. Due to the size of the number of applications and the processing time, because during the period of instruction, the asylum seeker can remain on the territory but with infernal social economic constraint. The administration framework influences efficiently the processing of application file. Some NGO layers speak of expeditious decision and botched examination of application. The OFRA mission is a mission to investigate application of international protection, a mission of legal administrative protection, an advisory mission in the context of the asylum procedure to the border. It delivers an opinion to the Minister of the Interior of the, about the application of the Convention. The Director General of OFRA, by unilateral administrative act, grant or refuse the refugee statute to the applicant after instruction par administrative service. More than 110,000 asylum applications in 2019. In 2020, 77 decisions that was taken by OFRA in asylum application instance down because the COVID-19, where the borders was controlled. So the second administration, c'est le CNDA, Specialized Administrative Jurisdiction. The Refugee Appeal Commission was changed because in the beginning of the life of this institution, there is only 300 per year decision by the commission. It was a commission. From with the multiplication of the conflict in the world and the immigration condition, the number of cases researched before the commission increased considerably by 16,000 cases, and today 46,000 cases in 2021. The first administrative court specialized in the number of cases created this court, which was become the National Court of Asilum. It changed the name, and it was attached to the Council of State, which is the administrative jurisdiction in France, for its management since January 29. Its job is to examine appeal against the deposition of referral projects of the Director General of PRA. This court is placed under the cassation control of the Council of State. You have the first decision, the decision of administrative, so the court is in appeal, and in the cassation, it is a Council of State, and it is a full litigation. in the first time, it was only the annulation of the decision of the director of FRA. Today, the court has the possibility to substitute to the director of FRA to have a good decision. It is a progress. Well, this is an activity of the CNDAs in 2021. I said 46,000 new cases, 42,000 decisions, and 10,000 protection orders, with 60% recognized and free. Yes. 5 minutes, yes, it is sufficient for me. Yes, no problem. And the other aspect is the immigration law codification. The immigration law codification was instituted by the ordinance of November 24. It is the sign of the transformation of a legal frame of the migration. Why? Because the codification under constant law constitutes in the text, but is not in positive law. The previous texts are expressly replayed, but their content included in the code. Under the pressure of xenophobic obedience, a huge work of recodification was carried out at the initiative of President Macron. It is by ordinance and not by the wall that this drawing of the code was carried to achieve the code entry and residence of foreigners and right of asylum. You see that it is also an executive order to reorganize the law. Why codification and what is the scope of this legislative law? It is an hierarchical organization legal text. The definition gives a strength to the idea of a functional work allowing the updating of the text and in practical access for citizens. In reality, the codification accompanies the unstable and regulatory production of the administrative power of the Ministry of the Interior. This cause is a document of 700 articles of legislative value and 85 century regularly article. So, fortunately for you, there is a text above me. So, the new flow is emblematic of this hostility and political breeding ground mixed with xenophobic rise, an integrationic conception of the immigration. For example, the family reunification and monogamy, equality of men and women, respect for the physical integrity of children and adolescents, respect for the freedom of marriage, school attendance, respect for ethnic and religious difference, acceptance of the rules that France is a secular republic. That are the new conditions to be open in France. As provided in Article 47, the residence permit issued to spouse of the basis of family regulation may be withdrawn in the event of the breakdown of cohabitation within 3 years. Is it true? Second, an administrative apparatus to control the immigration. It is the law of 2018, which was this law was presented yesterday by my colleague. It's not necessary to have the study of this, but in the context there is a criminalization of the migrant. The evolution of law with the word used in this sector: flow, waves, stock, sorting, especially talent people immigration. The state is choosing the good and the bad migrant. This is the sorting of the migration. It is new in the mentality of the French legal system. A discrimination between different people and a sort of utilitarianism conception of the human condition. The word. So the crisis, you know, this crisis is not very important. With Ukraine in Calais, it's not very important, no. So just a small sunshine in this sky. In contrast with this xenophobic evolution, the Constitutional Council considered that the criminal law that punish assistance to the entry and residence of foreigners cannot apply to persons who have a not-for-profit provided assistance to persons in danger or insecurity. At the basis of this criminal exemption, the most important is the use for the first time in the French law of the constitutional principle of fraternity enshrined in the Constitution. So in conclusion of the legal analysis, France addressed the problem of the xenophonia through its powerful bureaucracy and its unilateral administrative law. But above all, immigration has become a major theme in the debate dividing the public opinion very deeply. It aggravates the tension between the different communities settled for decades in the territory. It is not certain that more repressive law and more powerful administration will solve the question of identity and security that crosses my country. I am sorry. Merci, President.
Many thanks, Professor Ferral, for this really detailed presentation. I think we have now got a very good overview of the situation in France, and I think my impression was that this highly sophisticated immigration law set very well echoes, mirrors the general sentiment in Europe. The hostility towards immigration, and even if those more extreme forces did not prevail in the elections, I think the general attitude has now been adopted by also by centrist governments, and so we see that this is a good example in kind of the general situation in Europe. Yes. So many thanks again. And now we would continue with Professor Übersachs. Wir haben Platz genug, also das geht gut. Na, hier wäre was frei? Oder? Ah, okay, dann könnten Sie direkt den Computer bedienen. Ja. Okay. So, I use the time as we have many speakers, so we must be careful to respect the timetable. We use the time to present Professor Peter Übersachs. I'm very happy to have him here. He's a professor at Basel University. He's a professor of public law and also judge with a specialization in particular in migration law. So in a certain sense, he combines theory and practice in this very complicated topic. This is a really important qualification. We've been cooperating together with Professor Stefan Breitenmoser in various research projects in the field of migration and asylum law. Without exaggeration that Professor Übersachs and Professor Breitenmoser are surely the foremost experts in the field of the Swiss immigration and asylum law in the European and international context, and of course in the context of the Swiss constitutional legal order. Most pertinently, Professor Übersachs will speak today about Switzerland and the European migration law. Please, use the floor.
At the lunch, I was asked what I was thinking to talk about, and then I answered, look, I'm talking about this exotic small country in the middle of Europe, embedded in the European migration law, which still stands and focalized on its independence and sovereignty. So we want to be independent, but obviously we are linked to everything around us, and that's the already a description of the difficulty of Swiss migration law, our own law, but it's not our own law. We have so many influences from outside, and we try also to influence the outside, of course. So I'll start with the framework, probably known to you, but take it as an introducing repetition, just to see the global aspect of Swiss migration law. Switzerland has not ratified the Global Compact for Migration. Also, a Swiss diplomat was really one of the one who defined it, who wrote it, but at the end, for political reasons, Switzerland has not ratified the compact. But astonishingly, the Global Compact of Refugees, yes. And of course, the Geneva Refugees Convention a long time ago. Now, Switzerland, as you all know, is not a member of the European Union. However, of course, of the European Council, and thus bound by the European Human Rights Convention and the jurisdiction of this convention. Switzerland is not a member of the European Economic Area, and this is again a similar paradoxon, because Switzerland, again here in the beginning of the 1990s, was the motor, the engine of the European Economic Area, but in a referendum, the Swiss people in 1992 rejected the partnership membership of EEA. And here you see that we, with our system of direct democracy, we are in a special political situation too. We have to sell our European migration policy to the people, to convince the people. And probably we're the only country in Europe where so many votes, referendums have taken place about this. And sometimes it didn't work, like in this case, but very often it worked. And I guess if you try to think, if a new country, you have a referendum about free movement of persons, are you sure you would have a majority of your population voting for it? It's not so evident, not so obvious. Switzerland several times voted on free movement of persons, and that was accepted by the people. So Switzerland is, I repeat, not a member of the EEA, but of the EFTA. The EFTA, there are just 4 states remaining: Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland. And after the EEA was rejected, Switzerland looked for a new solution, and this solution with the EU are the so-called bilateral, or if you prefer, sectorial treaties. And between these treaties there are a few concerning, obviously, migration. So, as I already mentioned, the Free Movement of Persons Agreement, then the association to Schengen law, including Frontex and the Return Directive, the association to the Dublin law, in particular today the Dublin III regulation. I will come back to these treaties later. In the national law, we have as many countries surrounding us. We have the system of 2 circles. As you probably know also, we have the first circle with the EU and EFTA nationals who profit from the free movement, as do the Swiss in the reverse sense, a point that often is not mentioned in the political discussion. So in the political discussion, you always have the impression everybody wants to come to Switzerland. But that Swiss people can go to a great part of Europe. You never hear that. Then we have some often quite old bilateral treaties from the 19th century, part of it, offer settlement or residence rights. These treaties have no big importance anymore, but in small technical legal questions they are still applicable. And the national law, of course, completes the legal position of EU and EFTA nationals where there is no solution or nothing in the treaties. Now, the second circle, that's the so-called third countries nationals, their legal position is defined by the national law. In addition, some international treaties can be applicable, ECIHR, Geneva Refugees Convention, etc. But for the usual migration, it's national law. Mostly, these people do not have migration rights, with exception under special conditions, as you know them, family reunion from the European Convention of the Human Rights, etc. And again, we have the talent, system. Usually, we only want specialists and persons with executive powers, or persons who bring money to Switzerland, only entitle them to settle down in Switzerland. A special point in these circumstances is that we have concluded bilateral treaties with the UK too, after Brexit, to guarantee the rights to the people who have profited from the free movement before. So that's also in both ways applicable. The UK now, besides this, is part of the second circle. Now, the Swiss refugee law is a combination of the Refugee Convention and the National Asylum Law. And in principle, asylum is granted in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Subsidiary protection is granted in accordance with our national law. And which a Swiss speciality, which is really regrettable, but it's the case politically, like that. The granted conditions in subsidiary protection are clearly less generous than the asylum conditions. So we have here a gap between the conditions we give these people. The legal order is completed by the Dublin law, and besides the asylum status and the subsidiary protection, Swiss law knows the temporary protection and the special conditions, installed already in 1998, so before the EU installed their temporary protection system. But it was, as in the European Union, never used until this year, in certain parallelity to the European Union. It was activated in March due to the Russian-Ukrainian war. And again, here too, the conditions granted to the Ukrainians are clearly better than what we offer under usual subsidiary protection. And we have the discussion in Switzerland too. Is that correct? Is that legal? Is that not a discrimination or not? This discussion is open. In 2019, Switzerland installed new rules in the Federal Asylum Act in order to accelerate the asylum procedure. As a compensation, now the asylum seekers get free advice and free legal representation during the procedure. We partly followed or copied the system of the Netherlands, but with our own model. It's not exactly the same, but we took some parts that we found in the Netherlands and introduced this new story. It seems to be a sort of a success story. It seems we have not much experience yet. The first effects show that we have fewer appeals, faster decisions, but higher success when somebody appeals. When appealing, then we have higher success. So the free legal representation has the effect that fewer appeals are made, but the appeals that are made are more effective. So that's the first impression we have from this new system, and we know that several EU member states seem to be interested in these new procedures and have asked to have some explanation about it. Now, where are the links between Swiss and European migration laws? Obviously, we are bound by the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights regarding migration law, above all in application of Articles 3, 5, 8, and 13. We are only partially bound by the case law of the Court of Justice, the Luxembourg Court. There is no appeal to this Luxembourg Court against Swiss decisions in migration law. It's up to our Swiss courts to decide about the importance of European law and the applicability. Regarding the free movement of persons agreement, Switzerland is only bound by the jurisprudence before, now look exactly, the 21st June of 1999. So that's the so-called static effect of the acquis communautaire. So Switzerland, in its sovereignty, only accepted, that's the date of the signature of the free movement agreement, to accept the acquis communautaire at this moment of the signature, but not what happened afterwards. And you can imagine we have a gap now in the evolution of the jurisdiction of the new law, new act in the EU and in this bilateral agreement between Switzerland and the EU. The Swiss Federal Supreme Court has, however, decided to install a parallel law system to fight against this gap, a parallel law system, as long as there are no good reasons not to do so. As long as there's not a reason against the parallel system, so the Swiss Supreme Court is ready to accept the evolution in Europe, the European Union, to accept the jurisdiction of Luxembourg and copy it or take it over. But as soon as there is a decision on the base of a non-binding grounds, above all the Citizenship Directive, which is not applicable for Switzerland, as soon as Luxembourg decides on this grounds of the Citizenship Directive, the Swiss Federal Supreme Court doesn't consider that Switzerland is bound. So you see that there are, we try to not make the gap too big, but we can't prevent that there is a gap, and the longer it goes, the bigger the gap will be. In difference to this, because the EU has learned the lesson of this free movement agreement, the EU insisted on the fact that Schengen and Dublin associations are not static. So Switzerland had to accept, when Switzerland take over or associated to Schengen and Dublin, had to accept a dynamic solution. That means that new evolutions of Schengen and Dublin law are not automatically applicable in Switzerland, but Switzerland is bound to take them, to accept them, has 2 years usually to do so, because it can be necessary to have a vote, popular vote on it. We have already heard from my colleague Breitenmoser. Last weekend we had a vote about Frontex financial, so that takes some time. And we have had several votes, and as far as until today, we have already always accepted the new evolutions, new developments. So that's the dynamic character of Schengen and Dublin. In refugee law, we have special links in, as I told you, in competing, in taking part in Dublin law and also in Eurodac, but we are not participating in the common European asylum system. Being in the middle of Europe, without sea borders or land borders to non-Schengen countries, Switzerland is rather privileged in the Dublin system. I can, anyway, a short anecdotal story to show you what at the time the problems were when Switzerland adopted Schengen Dublin. It was in the years 2005 to 2008. And as all other Schengen Dublin state members, we had to undergo a severe examination if we fulfill the conditions for Schengen Dublin. And one of the big points was you have to protect better your external borders. Do you understand this? Where are the external borders of Switzerland to non-Schengen states? Of course, the two big international airports, Zurich and Geneva. That was okay. The point where some EU member states put their finger on it was the border to Liechtenstein. Because at the moment, Liechtenstein was not a Schengen state. Now, Liechtenstein is surrounded by Schengen states and has no airport. So where is the problem? Where is the problem? But it was insisted as, and Switzerland and Liechtenstein have a common tariff and border control system. But obviously the border between Liechtenstein and Switzerland was never controlled. So it was asked for Switzerland to control this border. What was the solution? Because it's nonsense, you agree, yeah? The solution was that Switzerland put 3 or 4 video cameras on the border to film what happened, and then everything was okay. And 3 years later, when Liechtenstein joined Schengen, we could take the cameras away. So those were the problems at the time, and today we can laugh about this, but it's okay. So Switzerland participates in the EASO office in Malta. Also voluntarily participated in the relocation program for the EU in 2015, and by activating the system of temporary protection this year, we, as I already told you, we have a comparable system to the temporary protection directive of the EU. Now I want to end with the other way around. I told you how we are positioned in the European migration law. But the question is also, how do you position you from the other states, EU and EFTA states? How do you see or applicate the common migration law? I have great doubts that all of the EU member states make a difference between the EEA members, also Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland. We have not the same rules, that are applicable. But I think many of the states don't really make a difference. They treat us the same because it's too complicated for them to see what happens with all those differences. I have a sort of confirmation of a colleague, Professor Tobler, in Basel, who teaches European law in Basel for 50%, and in Leiden in the Netherlands for 50%. And when she got the chair in Leiden, she asked for a residence permit in the Netherlands, and the Dutch asked for her to pay for this permit the price for not EU and EEA nationals. And she went to court. She said, no, you have to treat me on an equal, you can't make a difference. And she won. And she told me that now the Dutch, they changed the law and they treat Swiss as they treat EEA nationals. So obviously, as far as I understand, Netherlands doesn't make a difference. However, a colleague from me, who is a lawyer, an attorney in Zurich, and makes a lot of migration law. He took a case to the Oberverwaltungsgericht Berlin-Brandenburg in 2014. And he told them, look, the Swiss Federal Supreme Court has installed this parallel system. And the case he had was the same, put the same question, and he told them, it would make sense if you install also the parallel system when you apply the free movements agreement. And hence the Oberverwaltungsgericht Berlin-Brandenburg was convinced and decided in this way. So they decided also to take over the jurisdiction of the Swiss Federal Court and to install also this, or apply also this parallel system. But I have no knowledge if that's a practice or jurisdiction which is spread, or is it just this only one decision, judgment of Berlin-Brandenburg. Then the next question would be, how do you evaluate the Swiss participation in Schengen and Dublin law? And how do you evaluate the bilateral way? We know that's a big political issue at the moment. Yeah, it won't be easy to find a solution. And the last question I dare to submit to you, if you are eager to discuss about it, how big is eventually, or maybe your interest in the Swiss accelerated asylum procedure? As I told you, there are several states which have addressed their interest in it. So that's a point where maybe we can show or give you some ideas how to handle it. I thank you for your interest.
So many thanks again, Professor Uber-Sachs, for this very insightful presentation. I think this presentation now evidenced the importance of having such a study being presented by an expert who is both an academic and a practitioner, because immigration law is so complicated, is so closely interwoven with administrative law, so that I think that a practitioner can give, also with his many very colorful examples, another picture and other insights in this really challenging subject. Professor Uber-Sachs himself posed some questions that we could put to him, and I can imagine that you have also further questions also with regard to the other presentations. I would propose that we will gather all these questions for the final debate. So it can also be more effective, and perhaps we can also compare these different national situations. Now we could pass on to the second block of this afternoon with presentations by younger experts in this field. They've been dedicated an even smaller time slot of 10 minutes, but I think they will do it, they will manage it. And before we could perhaps also... yes, Professor Cataldi. Yeah, she's of course also a younger expert, and so I would... she has 20 minutes. Okay, so we could say yes. She is also button. Okay, okay. I fear yes. Okay, okay. But yes, we could also manage it this way. My center point is now that whether we have now the coffee break or afterwards. What we now? Okay, so this was a plebiscite. Plebiscite, and so we'll pass on to the coffee break. Yeah, yeah.
adesso funziona.
So I'm happy to see you again for this second part of our afternoon session. Before I wanted to discriminate all young speakers and attribute them only 10 minutes, but of course Professor Noshang deserves more time, especially because she's a renowned expert in this field, and furthermore she had a journey of over 20 hours to come to here, to come to Naples, and also this fact has to be appreciated. And last but not least, of course, she has a very highly interesting topic to present. And I must say that I'm really pleased to have here a young academic from the Southern Hemisphere. Professor Graziotin Noshang is a professor of international law at the University of Passo Fundo in Brazil, specializing in migration and asylum law, but also with a special focus on teaching. I find this to be a subject we should generally dedicate more attention to, as this is the instrument through which we as academics can primarily try to give a meaningful contribution to the solution of the challenges migrants and asylum seekers, as well as the respective societies, are faced with. So we will dedicate particular attention to your presentation. Professor Graziotin Noshang, yours the floor.
Grazie mille, professore Hippold. Grazie anche all'invitata dei professori Castaldi. È un piacere stare qui con voi. Of course, I'm going to speak in English regarding the special issue of this conference. What I would like to share with you is about how we can apply the refugee and migration law in Brazil, especially on the teacher way, but also what we called extension program university. So first, we have to recognize that Brazil has ratified the Geneva Convention of Status of the Refugee in 1972, and also the Protocol 1997, and this became a law of 1997. This refugee status in Brazil was regulated by this law, and this delay of the implementation of the international legislation was due to the period in which Brazil was governed by a military forces, and the guarantees and the respect of human rights practically disappeared. With the Brazilian democratization process through the federal constitution reform in 1988, the rights of fundamental guarantees returned. And the law 9474 of 1997 include extending definitions of the refugees concerning the critical and generalized violation of human rights mentioned in the 1984 Cartagena Declaration for Refugees. This is a regional document from the Inter-American system, Inter-American human rights system. According to this law, the migrant that arrive in the national territory that fits in the article first requires will be able to ask the recognition of refugee status. Making the online application for analysis by the National Committee for Refugees, we call the CONARE, Comitê Nacional para Refugiados, associated with the Ministry of the Justice. Also, it's important to say that this request nowadays is taking around, to be recognized as a refugee is taking around 4 years. So the request, the person who requests a recognition for refugee status. It has a temporary protocol, so you have to wait for the decision of this organ. This, especially, I'd like to point out also this Article 1, Paragraph 3, which include the Cartagena Declaration massive violation of human rights of the circumstances which have seriously disturbed in public order. This is the argument that we can recognize the Venezuelans as refugees because they are not persecution. We don't have find persecution in this case. And so the CONARI, this committee, recognized the Venezuelans as a refugee regarding this part of these articles. In the other way, we have also the migration law, which aligns the primary international documents for human rights and Universal Human Rights Declaration in the Universal Plan and the American Convention of Human Rights in the local plan. The text also considers the provisions contained in the conventions of 1951, refugee status, and also the stateless person status of 1954. Our first law, our law before of this 1345 to 2017, it was the 68515, 1980, which regard the security provisions, and the migrants were not welcome. And this is, reflects also that the period of dictatorship in Brazil. So we had a long way to change the law. And now we have a very established, a very recognized by also international community as a law who includes all the universal human rights inside this, this statute. So the immigration law innovates in considering the categories of migrants, both immigrant, and migrants, stateless, and bringing also the humanitarian aspect in favor of human rights and fundamental guarantees. The law consists in 125 articles, and also in the Article 3 and 4 determines the principles and the guidelines that hold the Brazilian migratory policy in the 22 items. So among the, we can emphasize among these principles the universality, the indivisibility, the interdependence of the human rights, the repudiation and prevention of xenophobia, the racism and the discrimination, the not criminalization of migration, and the humanitarian reception. Article 4, the guarantees we can set it in the national territory with the condition of equally with the natives, with the Brazilian nationals, the inviolability of the right to life, freedom, equality, safe, and the poverty, and ensured all the others rights. Also, civil, social, cultural, economic rights, and freedom. So, if you have the best legislation, what's the big deal? The big deal is to implement, always. So, what's the difficulties of the implementation? First, the government structure. Second, the regional and bilateral agreements. And at the least, or not the last, the administrative acts regarding published by the Ministry of Foreign Relations, Justice and Labor. These acts, we start with these difficulties, thinking about the government structure. The migration to Brazil increased, but the structure was the same as the 80s. So we don't have personnel to deal with a lot of requests, but a lot of requests, too many requests for Brazil is a few requests for you. I was comparing my data with the presentation. which gives the numbers from France. So it seems for us, for you, it's going to seem for nothing, probably. And we have also the regional agreements. Brazil is inside Mercosur, and also it's a part of the Organization of American States. And all this implementation of the law is from administrative acts. That's the big problem. Why? First, starting with the implementation of the Geneva Convention. So, as I said before, the refugee request is have to apply for the refugee status, and he's going to the policy, the federal police is going to give him this first document, which that one is blank. So it's a piece of paper, it's a blank piece of paper, a sheet, and you can put your photo, then you dropped, and this is your document. So how you feel secure with this kind of document? How people believe that you are a refugee seeker? So this kind of insecurity, it reflects when the asylum seekers, or we don't call asylum seeker, but the refugee status is, and this request also has to be renewed. I mean, you have to ask again in a year. So until the CONARE have the decision. Some of the federal police officer has the second document, which is provisory, but it's a few of them, and it costs for the government more than a piece of paper, of course. And then when the CONARE recognizes as a refugee, you can give this second document, which is going to be the recognition of refugee. So the problem is that the CONARE has 7 members only, and these 7 members is with the reality of the law in 1997. So that this reality is changed a lot, and that's why we don't have structure to analyze too many requests for refugee seekers, and that's why it takes so long to analyze the requests. And the other way, how migrants can get inside Brazil, the same way that they go to the other countries. We have to request for a visa and the consulate and go, and you are going to request your document. But that's not the real life. So we receive a lot of migrants which hasn't applied for a visa before entrance in Brazil. What's the problem? So we have, the very good legislation, which is the 13445, which states that you can be inside Brazil as a visit visa, a temporary, or we call the residence authorization. We don't call more permanent residence. So the problem is again the government structure. The federal policy in Brazil has just few agents to analyze and to give the decision to these visas. Also, in the pandemic time, we had the difficulties that the federal police closed the office. So migrants who has the visa expired are still expired. Why? because, for example, in Passo Fundo, the city in which I live, we have only 2 agents from the federal police to receive requests for migrants to 123,000. So, I'm going to explain this a little bit before. Then we have the agreement of Mercosur plus associate states, which is Bolivia, Chile, Ecuador, Peru, and Colombia. And we have the administrative acts. These administrative acts starts to legislate from entrance regarding nationality. So it's completely against to the umbrella law, which is include, which protect, which prevent discrimination. So these acts are one administrative act, for example, for Venezuelans, another administrative act for Haitians, another for Mercosur citizens, another for Suriname, and so on. In this, these administrative acts increased during the pandemic time, closing the borders for Venezuelans, closing the borders for Mercosur citizens, closing the borders, and so on. Well, here we have the numbers of the solicitations of refugee by month in Brazil from 2010 for 2020. We can see the increase after the legislation change, especially after the September or January or 2018. But it's still not compared with the European data. Here we have the platform, which is from only for refugee system. And we have the numbers here since 2016 and 2021. And we have 75,203 decisions in total. The main nationality are the Venezuelans, the second are the Senegalese, and the third the Haitians. And afterwards, Syria, Angola, Cuba, and República Democrática of the Congo. What we can point here, Senegal is not recognized as a refugee. Even they request for this status, they are not recognized as a refugee. But as the request takes so long, they have to, the residents to ask for another situation in Brazil, which is a temporary residence authorization. So it's a kind of management to regulate your situation inside of Brazil. And here we are in the Passo Fundo city. So this is our university. We're located in the south of Brazil state, and in the northwest of Brazil. We have these 2 projects in Brazil, which is a research group of the master degree, and we published the last 2 years 2 e-books. Unfortunately, it's in Portuguese, but if you want to read, it's a pleasure to share with you. One is the 2020 is a work based on the studies of the Abdullah Sayad, the immigration paradox of the immigration. And the second one is based on the studies of Franz Fanon and also Joaquim Herrera Flores from Spain. This is our tests from the research group, and we joined these studies from the research group to the extension program. So this extension program is called Refugee and Migrant Service Desk, and we created in 2021, especially when we, in the field that I participate also in another institution called the Fórum de Mobilidade Humana. So it's Human Mobility Forum. And this forum is composed by institutions for civil society, which we join a month, and also to hear, to listen the difficulties by the migrants. We have also the representatives of the migrants inside this forum. And one of the requests for the migrants are, we need help. So who is going to help us? Federal police is a few agents. Who is going to help us to regularize our documents if we have 22 forms to regulate, to make migratory regularization in Brazil? So that was decided. We decided to approve inside of the University of Passo Fundo a desk, a service desk, for free, of course, to help migrants to documental regularization. And this this program is the first one which has an agreement with the federal police in Brazil, and also is recognized by the Cátedra Sérgio Vieira de Mello. It's a chair in Brazil which recognizes the works with, by the university and immigration with research and extensions programs. So what this is fine. Actually not. Why? Because the public sector, I mean the government is sharing their responsibilities with the universities, or better, transferring the work, what they should do, to the universities. And also the human rights, the UN High Commissary of Refugee is supporting university to do what the government are not doing. So this is our data in the Refugee and Migrant Service Desk. This is only from the April and May of 2022. Most of the migrants that we attend, we help, are Venezuelans, we can see that. And the second are Haitians, and the third, Cubans and Senegal. For conclusion, what we have. So we have the very good legislation, we have the best one, but how we are going to implement? Although the law brought an advance in the human rights and fundamental rights, the practice is completely different from the stated in the test. The operators do not work with the law to accomplish the documental regulation by dozens of inferior administrative acts to seek to regulate what the law did not foresee. Nowadays, we consider 19 ways to consider the nationality administrative acts. The law operators are demanding it is even more difficult for migrants. If it's difficult for us, imagine for the migrants. The normative context of Brazil migratory legislation has an umbrella law that guarantees rights for all, but in practice, this is not works like so well. And this lack of sufficient personnel in the immigration station of federal policy cause an insecurity for migrants with visas and have their documents expired. How we are going to say to the employers that the document is valid regarding an administrative act? No, I can say it's expired. No, you have an administrative act that guarantee that this document is valid. How could? And so it's a fight every day. I'd like to, so that's why I'm talking afterwards, and I'd like to thank you for your attention, and it's going to be a pleasure if you have any question.
So many thanks, Professor Grazzettin Noshang, for this fine presentation. I think it was quite helpful to look beyond the situation in Europe and to look at a reality that is so different and at the same time also strikingly similar to the many situations here in Europe. For example, I found it also highly interesting to see that universities become agents of immigration administration. Before I had a talk with Professor Übersachs, who also taught me that some universities in Switzerland have now adopted a similar job for the government. So I think this would be a quite interesting task also for our universities to be involved more actively in this job. But perhaps we can talk about it afterwards in the discussion. Now we continue with Dr. Michele Corletto. Michele Corletto is a researcher of international law at the online university Pegaso Online University. Some participants will ask what is this, but in Italy, online universities also in the field of law have a longer tradition. In a certain sense, they were trailblazers for a process that with COVID-19 has now seized all so-called traditional universities. They have now all discovered, with some delay, the virtues of remote teaching. As we know, also our conference is offered in a hybrid form, and also we have switched to online teaching, and I must say it worked well. But now to Dr. Corletto. He has been specializing in asylum and migration law for several years. He's a member of important commissions and study groups in this field. Today he will speak about the protection of unaccompanied minors in international law, probably one of the foremost challenges, I would say, in the area we are dealing in these 2 days. Please, Dr. Corletto, yours the floor.
Good afternoon. Thanks very much to Professor Wilpold, and many thanks to MAPS Network and to Professor Cataldi for giving me the opportunity to speak about a topic very delicate and very close to my own studies as a researcher in international law. What we're going to look at today is the protection of unaccompanied minors in international law. The unaccompanied minors are a very complex topic. They have become a fundamental migratory subject. They are increasing in quantity for the dramatic push factors, for their three times vulnerables. In fact, they are minors, they are refugees, and they are alone. Yet they are on the margins on the migration debate, and as we can see on the screen, there are many open issues on these topics. First of all, the definition, the qualification of unaccompanied minor, what is an accompanied minors, and what is the impact of the principle, the best interest of the child on their reinforced protection. Then the statistics on unaccompanied minors, there is an issue regarding the unclear and specific reconnaissance and monitoring of data about unaccompanied minors. Then the international protection of frameworks of unaccompanied minor had insufficient or not harmonizing application in the international framework. Then there are other issues open about them that regarding age determination, age assessment, the reception and detention of unaccompanied minors, and the return proceedings, the family reunification, and the rule of the guardians for the unaccompanied minors, and the Dublin transfer regulation and its reforms. So first, we going to look at who is an accompanied minors. The first question is the definition. As we know by international document, international children's rights document, a minor is a person below the age of 18. As we know from the United Committee of the Rights of the Child in the General Comment number 6, 2005, an accompanied minor is who is separated from both parents and other relatives and is not being carried by an adult who by law or customs and is responsible for doing so. Therefore, he is in need of international protection. There is the need to take care of this person. The child indeed get an extra protection. The first international law instrument specifically introduced for minors was in 1989, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, that is mostly ratified by all UN member states, and with one of the exception, the USA. It's a big surprise to me. And in this convention is foreseen a specific definition of how to protect minors. Fundamental is the Article 3, Paragraph 1, that says, in all action concerning children, whatever undertaken by public or private social welfare institutions, courts of law, administrative authorities, or legislative bodies, the best interest of the child shall be a primary consideration. So this international provision works better in conjunction with the EU law Article 24 of EU Charter of Fundamental Rights that says that in paragraph 2, the child's best interest must be a primary consideration. It's crucial what we see in these two articles, that in an international framework, the principle of the best interest of minors has to be the first aspect to be considered in order to protect the minors. The notion of the best interest of the child was developed well before the time when children were explicitly guaranteed human rights. Indeed, reference to the best interest was essentially designed to constitute a standard for decision-making on initiative to be taken in regard to children in the absence of such right. Then, the best interest of the child is the fundamental principle of all legislation for the protection of the minors, especially in the most vulnerable minors, of course. The international legal instruments, in fact, are based on this principle, which is formally stated in all the convention and all declarations dedicated to the child. The international legal instrument dedicated to the minors, however, do not define the superior interest of the child, leaving into the discretion of the interpreter, in particular the judge, to establish the content of the terms. In the absence of a definition of the concept of, and since it is a principle contained in international provision, it must be interpreted in the light of the 1969 Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, Article 31 and 33. The terms of best interest of the child appears for the first time in the 1969 UN Declaration on the Rights of the Child. The declaration in Principle 2 stated that the child shall enjoy special protection, and the best interest of the child shall be the paramount consideration. So, the Dublin Third 604 to 2013 set out some criteria for a best interest of the assessment, such as family reunification, possibilities, the child well-being and development, the views of the child in accordance with his or her age and level of maturity, and safety and security consideration, especially with regard to a risk that the child may be a victim of trafficking. In this process of reconstructing the exact concept of the principle under consideration, a further criterion that can be used is the analysis of the Committee's general comments on the rights of the minors. It's clear that there is an universal tendency to consider the belief that the best interest of the child should be safeguarded in preference to others. This is a chart, is the timeline of the development of children's rights. If we try to reconstruct the Children International Regulatory Instrument before the 1989 UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, we can see that the first document that speak about rights for minors is a Declaration of the Rights of the Child adopted by League of Nations as a Geneva Declaration in 1924. In preamble, the declaration states that men and women of all nations recognize that humanity must offer the child the best it has, declare and accept as their duty. Now that we consider the international framework of the most important legal instrument to protect the unaccompanied minors, it's possible to move to some statistics. And let's look at the Eurostat statistic that give us a rough overview on minors entering in the European Union. As we can see on the chart in the middle, Italy and Greece have taken a large amount of unaccompanied minors. Germany and other EU countries, however, have taken large amount of unaccompanied minors for secondary migration. On these statistics, we can see also that the situation changes following the different member status. The arrival of country depends also on the country of departures. For example, in Italy, we can see that many come from Tunisia, Egypt, Pakistan, among others, and in Malta, many comes from Bangladesh, Eritrea, and so on. And if we want to consider the protection framework on international scale, there are many aspects to take into account. For international protection, refugees and subsidiary protection have to be investigated. Furthermore, there are some specific forms of persecution for children, like recruitment as child soldier, forced marriage for young females, and female genital mutilation. In this framework, another important document is family reunification, especially Directive 2003, in particular Article 2. Unaccompanied minors means third country national or stateless person below the age of 18 who arrive on the territory of the member state unaccompanied by an adult. We also need to consider that a minor has the right to bring his direct family to the country he or she arrived in. However, the country can simply wait until the minor reaches the age of 18 and grant asylum, the grant asylum, of course, thus preventing family reunification. Another point, I go fast, regarding the age, determination. Another point of concern is the age assessment. Yes, we can find some information on the General Comment 6 of the United Committee of Children and in some European Asylum Support Office guidelines on age assessment that can be considered. There are two methods regarding the age assessment, non-medical methods and medical method radiation-free. Regarding the rule of the guardian is very important, the rule of the guardian, because the guardian mandate includes, above all, ensuring child's overall well-being. Beside this, the safeguard of the child's best interests and exercise of the legal representation and complement the child's limited legal capacity. As you can see, in conclusion, the member state must discuss how to promote a harmonizing legislation in a practical manner to avoid the dangerous perpetuation of current gaps in protection of unaccompanied minors. And the idea is that the lack of a proper reform of the Dublin regulation should be corrected by a solidarity mechanism among member states and more attention for unaccompanied minors. Thanks very much for listening to my intervention. As you are aware, this is a very complex topic that involved different scenarios and many, many actors. Thank you again for your attention, and I hand you back to Professor Hilpold. Thanks.
So many thanks to Dr. Corletto for this well-structured presentation, and I think you will all have noticed that Dr. Corletto is really informed, really well-prepared about the subject, and he's also writing a monograph about this topic, and one sees his excellent preparation in this field. Unfortunately, we only have a small time slot for this highly important topic. So we will continue with the presentation by Anna Fazzini. Anna Fazzini is a young researcher specializing in the field of migration and asylum law at the University of Napoli Orientale, and collaborating with Professor Giuseppe Cataldi, the director of this project, as we know. She has already done much research in this area, also within the Italian Society of International and European Law. What I was most impressed of when I found her curriculum in the net was that besides her high marks at school and at university, there was her intense active engagement with civil society in the attempt to provide a contribution to the challenges set by migration and asylum requests. Today she looks at a broader issue that is more and more recognized to be pivotal in the academia. Migration as a consequence of environmental issues. So we are eager to learn from a stock taking and look forward in this field. Here's the floor.
Thank you, Professor. Okay, thank you, Professor Hilpold, for your introduction, and good evening to everybody. In my brief presentation, I would like to outline some recent developments in the field of the protection of the so-called environmental migrants, emerging from international and national case law, with specific reference to the case of Italy, where we can see interesting trends on the matter. Actually, these developments seem to point to what is likely to be, at least in the near future, the most effective way to provide some kind of protection for cross-border migrants who move for reasons related to the effects of climate change, environmental disasters, environmental degradation. That is to expand the current framework of existing forms of protection, especially throughout an integrated human rights-based approach, according to which violations of social rights, such as the right to water, the right to food, can result in the violation of civil rights, such as the right to life, understood not only as the possibility of losing one's life, but also as the impossibility of leading a dignified life, a dignified existence. These developments appear to be very important because, as we well know, there is not an international legal framework adequate. The current international legal framework on the matter is defective and inadequate. I can't dwell too much on this, but I just want to recall that there is no binding instrument that provides a kind of protection for environmental migrants. There is no a recognition of a legal status for this category of migrants. There is not shared definition of this category of migrants. I'm using environmental migrants, but we can discuss on it because there is an ongoing debate on the matter on which term, which definition should be used. But there are several soft law documents, such as the Global Compact for Migration, which recognize the issue of environmental migrants. The Global Compact for Migration recognizes the effects of climate change, environmental degradation among the causes of migration. So let's see these interesting trends coming from the case law, and in this regard I would like to go straight to presenting the case of Italy, making few links to the international level. And before going over this specific aspect, I would like to make few references to the Italian legal framework on the matter. I need to be brief, so I will simply say that our system provides multiple forms of protection on environmental migrants. On environmental migrants, for example, we have temporary protection for significant humanitarian needs during natural disasters, a special residence permit in case of a serious calamity situation, and of course we have the humanitarian protection, which is effectively more applied. This residual form of protection that our system provides after, of course, the refugee status and the subsidiary protection. And so let's see these interesting trends with specific regard to the humanitarian protection. Actually, recently, last year, there was an important ordinance issued by the Italian Court of Cassation, the Supreme Court, which basically aligns itself with the famous Tetiota case findings, and going even further, because the Court stated that in order to assess the criteria for granting humanitarian protection, climate change, environmental degradation must be taken into account. This ordinance comes after several decisions from which a positive trend had already emerged. So the Court has gradually opened up to granting humanitarian protection on environmental or climate grounds. I reported some examples here. But actually, with this ordinance, the Supreme Court takes a step forward. The case concerns a citizen from the Niger Delta who unsuccessfully brought out an appeal before the Court of First Instance, since his application for international or humanitarian protection had been rejected. Actually, the lower court had established the existence of a serious environmental degradation in the applicant's area of origin due, as you know, to the land abuse caused by oil companies together with ethnic and political conflicts. But anyway, the lower court did not consider this situation to constitute a serious harm in order to grant the subsidiary protection, nor it considered at all the possibility of granting humanitarian protection. What the Italian Court, the Supreme Court said, as I have just said, the Supreme Court relied itself with the Toyota case findings, and in this regard, I briefly recall that in the Toyota case, Committee of Human Rights affirmed the applicability of the prohibition of refoulement in cases where climate change and environmental disasters undermine the right to life and the right to freedom for inhuman treatment, provides an evolutionary interpretation of the notion of dignified life, affirmed that the violation of the right to life can be established also in presence of a reasonably foreseeable risk, together with the inability of the states to fulfill its due diligence obligations. But in the present case, the committee didn't find the violation in question. Why? Because according to the committee, the Kiribati government has put in place sufficient measures to address the effects of climate change, so fulfilled its positive obligations, and the applicant didn't provide sufficient evidence to demonstrate a real, individualized, personal, and reasonably foreseeable risk to his right to life. So the committee introduced this high threshold because an individualized risk must be proved, and so a generalized risk resulting from climate change, environmental degradation is not considered sufficient. But our Supreme Court said that for the purposes of recognition of humanitarian protection, the assessment must be conducted with specific reference to the peculiar risk for the right to a dignified existence resulting from environmental degradation, climate change, or unsustainable development of the area, so explicitly. The Supreme Court provides an evolutionary interpretation of the notion of ineliminable core constituting the foundation of personal dignity. This concept actually was introduced in a previous well-known judgment and represents the parameter to which the judge must refer in order to assess the individual vulnerability that justifies the granting of humanitarian protection throughout an individual case by case of the applicant's private life in Italy compared with his personal situation experienced before the departure and the situation to which he would be exposed in case of return. So this concept is the minimum essential limit below which the right to a dignified existence is not guaranteed. And this limit must be appreciated, as I stated before, taking into account environmental disaster, climate change, and so on. So what appears to be new? Clearly, the fact that the Supreme Court explicitly recognizes the applicability of humanitarian protection in these cases. And another aspect is that the Supreme Court highlights the objective situation of environmental degradation in the applicant's country of origin, and the possible consequences of human rights resulting from a return. So there is no a specific focus on the personal and individual condition of the applicant that specifically caused the migration. And this could have implications also for the burden of proof upon the applicant that can be reduced, and this can be considered maybe a step forward with respect to the Toyota case, where this was a problem and actually the violation of the right to life was not found. This element can actually be a key point that could open up a more expensive interpretation of the prohibition of refoulement, because it should establish an effective but more general risk to the enjoyment of the applicant's human rights. So, in conclusion, which are the ways ahead for the protection of environmental migrants? Well, in absence or waiting for open question, an ad hoc legal instrument, the way is to expand the currently existing forms of protection. Considering the jurisprudential trend, the hope is that in addition to expanding beneficiaries of residual form of protection, courts can recognize more extensive protection, like the subsidiary protection, for example. And regarding the possibility of granting refugee status, well, this is an option, but this is a very discussed option, which presents several hurdles, starting from the notion of persecution, the link between the victim of persecution and the agent of persecution, but this is, I can't explore this now. I just want to recall, anyway, these recent guidelines, these High Commissioner for Refugees guidelines, which recommended to consider the refugee status for environmental migrants, because the adverse effects of climate change or natural disasters may be valid grounds for claiming refugee status in specific circumstances. So that's all. Thank you for listening.
So many thanks also from my side, Ms. Fazzini. I think my impression is that with this highly topical subject of environmental degradation and the effects on migration, this discussion is often conducted on a very high level of abstraction. And Anna Fazzini managed to present a very impressive case study about Italy, and thereby to join these two levels, the international level and the national level, very effectively. And so I think this was a really important presentation, and I suppose she's also writing a monograph on this subject, and so we can expect a really important book about this highly relevant subject. So many thanks again, and now we pass on to Professor Violeta Moreno-Lax, and this is my pleasure to present you one of the outstanding academics in migration and asylum law we had as members of our study research team in the MAPS project. She is one of the few that presented here in this final conference, but I think she is a very good representative of this project. Violeta Moreno-Lax is a professor of law at Queen Mary's University in London, specializing in international and EU law at the intersection with migration, border violence, and security. She has a very long curriculum with teaching assignments and posts with the most renowned universities in Europe. So it's a great honor to have you here also as a speaker. Professor Moreno-Lax will speak about the right to flee and racialized access to protection in Europe, an issue, by the way, that has become highly topical, again, as a consequence, as we already heard, of the Ukraine conflict, and ensuing accusations that Europe is adopting a double standard with regard to persons fleeing from this region by privileging them in respect to refugees from the southern hemisphere. Violeta, yours the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hilpold, for the very warm welcome. I need my slides. I don't know if we can have them? Yep. There we go. Okay. Right. So as it's been announced, I'm going to be talking about, I slightly changed the title because I didn't want to have the race word in it, since I'm not a specialist yet on any of it. So I've changed it to selective access to protection in Europe and the right to flee. And I'm going to be making a proposal on primary pathways. I mean, you will all be familiar with the nomenclature by UNHCR and others, speaking about complementary pathways to protection. And what I'd like to submit is that we need very urgently to start speaking about primary pathways to access international protection. And so what I'm going to be outlining fairly quickly, there is a longer version of this which has already been published, so I'm going to refer you to the longer paper version of the talk later on. But so I'm going to be speaking about the problem as I see it in the form of a selective, including racialized access to protection in Europe, but other parts of the world are concerned as well. The prevailing view that was presented, among others, by Professor Hathaway yesterday, that there is no individual right to access international protection as a matter of an individual right. And then my proposal to try and consider the law, perhaps in a wishful thinking way or in an imaginative manner, to see whether we can, I don't know if engineer would be the word, but find within standard versions of public international law what I have called a right to flee. So the problem is, as we've already been speaking about yesterday and today, that Europe is inaccessible, and the global north in general is become pretty inaccessible to those on the move in need of international protection. Non-white asylum seekers are usually treated as threats, as weapons. I mean, we've been speaking about a hybrid attack or a hybrid war that Belarus was waging on the European Union, employing migrants, utilizing asylum seekers and refugees as the currency, as the arms that they were attacking us with, therefore objectifying and reifying the existence of people who are holders of human rights and people who are in need of international protection and the bearers of human dignity as you and me. And so they are typically met with non-access, containment, and the externalization of international protection. And there is now, in the European Parliament and within the European institutions, a discussion on the reform of the Schengen Borders Code to avoid future episodes of the instrumentalization of migrants and their utilization for political purposes as weapons. And this is, unfortunately, the general rule. We do conceive of those on the move, whether they are in need of international protection or not, as threats, existential security threats to the existence of the European integration project. The exception, therefore, is the situation vis-à-vis Ukrainian refugees. They are white, they are Catholic or Orthodox, depending on the part of the country they live in. They are Christian anyways, and they've been portrayed in media as people who are just like us, as being more civilized than the refugees that come from developing countries, as is usually the public discourse in which they are presented to the world. And so they've been met with sympathy, empathy, and open arms, right? There's been visa-free travel that's been allowed, as Professor Gilt has presented earlier today. The temporary protection scheme that has been put in place for their protection and immediate access to international protection in the European Union has been the result of this scheme. But as I said, this is the exception. I hope that this brings us to a more optimistic situation in the future where all those in need of international protection are welcomed in the same manner. But I need to be a bit pessimistic because there are years and years and years of the rule being the rule. And the result of the externalization paradigm, or the non-entrée paradigm, or the non-accession paradigm, is that typically refugees are left with what has been called euphemistically spontaneous arrivals, meaning they need to employ, because they are typically subjected to visa criteria with which they can, by definition, not comply, Because, I mean, if you look at the Schengen Borders Code criteria for obtaining visas, people need to prove that they are capable of returning to the country of provenance after expiry of the visa. But legally, if you're a refugee, under the Refugee Convention and the Qualification Directive criteria, you need to demonstrate that you are incapable of returning to the country of provenance. And so either you comply with the refugee definition or you comply with the criteria for the issuance of a visa. But you cannot do both, legally speaking. You do one or you do the other, meaning that if you are a genuine refugee, and I'm choosing my words very consciously here, you cannot be a regular migrant. There's no way you can meet the two definitions at the same time, meaning that you're going to be treated, before you reach the territory of the external borders of the European Union, as an irregular migrant, as a security threat, as something that needs somebody who needs to be met with deterrence measures. And all of this normalizes the coercion that we've seen in the pictures and that we've seen in public discourse being employed against those in need of international protection. So what are the alternatives? The alternatives are very few, are small scale, and are typically ad hoc. I would like to see the manner in which Ukrainians have been welcomed in Europe as a pathway to that becoming the rule, but for the time being, if you look at the grand scheme of things, even the temporary protection scheme is quite small compared to the scale of need we are faced with when we look at the refugee population in the world. So the alternatives to spontaneous arrivals take the form of sometimes special labor mobility schemes, resettlement, private sponsorship mechanisms, family reunification, humanitarian admission, and so on. But as I said, these are small scale, ad hoc. They tend to be addressed to those who have already been recognized officially as being refugees and who are in situations of heightened vulnerability and who might have family or other ties to countries of asylum. And the most important element of all is that all of these schemes tend to be voluntary and goodwill-based. They are not undertaken as a matter of law. They are not undertaken as a matter of legal obligation. And even the Global Compact on Refugees makes an allusion to this point. Complementary pathways for admission can, but there is no obligation that they do, facilitate access to protection. There isn't a legal duty to facilitate access to international protection. And this is the prevailing view. There isn't a legally binding right to access asylum, and there isn't a corresponding obligation as a matter of law on the part of the signatories or state parties to the Refugee Convention or any other instrument of international human rights law with a universal remit that would generate such an obligation. So you do have Article 14 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights that recognizes that everyone has a right to seek and enjoy asylum in other countries, but this has been understood as a soft law instrument. I mean, there is a huge discussion about whether the declaration should not be considered part of customary international law, but if we leave that point to rest, it is not been transposed into any of the other UN human rights treaties. It's not part of the ICCPR, it's not part of the ICESRC, and it's not part of the Refugee Convention. So there isn't a legally binding obligation to regulate access to international protection. There isn't, as a result, any refugee-specific channels for admission for those in need of international protection to reach countries of asylum for the purposes of being admitted to the asylum procedure. Therefore, there are no primary pathways to asylum. So, how do we overcome this situation? If we were to, I mean, if you remember Professor Hathaway's list of problems, the first one, how do you address the big elephant in the room? How do you address the fact that we live in a non-entrée universe where access to international protection is not articulated, not recognized as a matter of right? And what I'd like to do is to focus on two elements of stamped public international law. So my argument is not one of de lege ferenda, but it's a matter of de lege lata, okay? And there are two elements. There already exists legally binding rights to asylum that have been recognized in regional instruments of human rights protection. That's one. And the second is perhaps a bit more exotic, but I would like you to keep an open mind, and if you're not convinced by my words today, I'll invite you to read the longer version where there is a lot of food for thought and hopefully a lot of references to other people's work that might be more convincing than mine. And it's the intersection between the right to leave any country, including one's own, together with the principle of non-refoulement, considered in tandem, holistically, and together. Both of these elements lead to what I have called, for lack of a better word, the right to flee. These two elements are of relevance to both, and this is one of the advantages of my argumentation, if you are happy to take it in. They're of relevance to signatories and non-signatories of the Refugee Convention. They stem from existing international human rights law obligations, and they, therefore, have to be taken into consideration as we speak, among other things, when implementing the pledges made as part of the Global Compact on Refugees. And so the first element, if we take them in the order, the right to asylum in regional human rights treaties finds concretization in 3 regions of the world, in America, in Africa, and in Europe. In America, you have Article 22 of the American Convention on Human Rights, recognizing explicitly, black on white, a right to seek and be granted asylum. In Africa, the formulation changes a little bit, and it is actually closer to the travaux préparatoires of Article 14 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and it says the right to seek and obtain asylum is actually a human right of the individual. And in the latest iteration of this right, we have Article 18 of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, recognizing in a very succinct formulation a right to asylum. And this is recognized in all 3 instruments as a right of the individual, rather than as a prerogative of the state. We're not talking about the right of asylum of states around the world, we're talking about the right to asylum of individuals. In all 3 cases, we use imperative wording. Thereby, we should think that these provisions, like the other provisions in the other clauses found in these treaties, should be considered as being legally binding and producing legally binding obligations. So like any other clause within the same treaties, they should be deemed to produce an effective effect, and sorry for my unelegant formulation there, but there is, under public international law, a presumption against redundancy, so that things in treaties need to mean something, and if they are formulated in imperative wording, the something they mean is intended to generate an obligation. And I don't see any reasons why this reasoning, which is of general application everywhere else when speaking about international law, should not be applicable for current purposes. So we end up, if you buy my argument for a second, in a situation where there is nearly pan-regional recognition of a right to asylum that needs, in accordance with the presumption against redundancy, to be recognized as effective, accessible, and exercisable by individuals. I mean, the individuals that are addressed by these clauses. The second element is the intersection, which I think is use generative in international law, between the right to leave any country, including one's own, and the prohibition of refoulement. So in the space between these 2 provisions, there is what I have called the right to flee. So the right to leave, some people might object, it's not absolute in character, granted. It can be the object of limitations and restrictions, but those restrictions cannot be arbitrary, cannot be disproportionate, and cannot be discriminatory. They need to be in accordance with the law, necessary, and in the interest of one of the objectives recognized in the relevant provision. Public order, public safety, national security, the prevention of crime, or the prevention of health of morals, and the protection of the rights and freedoms of others. Nowhere will you find as legitimate the willingness to stem immigration or to contain refugee flows in countries beyond the state that ratified this provision. The second element is the prohibition of non-refoulement, which some people might say it's not part of customary international law. It might even less be jus cogens. But one portion of the principle of non-refoulement includes protection against torture. And torture itself, ill treatment, has been recognized universally as being part of jus cogens. So at least, I mean, if there is, which I think there shouldn't be any discussion on whether non-refoulement is or isn't part of public international customary law, but even if you were to buy that argument, the part of non-refoulement that rejects torture, I think is indisputably part of customary international law and jus cogens. And so if we take the formulation of what is forbidden as part of a refoulement arsenal of measures, the European Court of Human Rights in Hirsi defines actions that are forbidden because of being contrary to the principle as any action, the effect of which is to prevent migrants from reaching the borders of destination countries if those measures expose them to a real risk of ill treatment. If they do, then they are caught by the prohibition and they cannot be accepted. So when you put together the right to leave and the prohibition of non-refoulement, I think you end up in a situation where a right to flee needs to be recognized to those who are in need of international protection. The longer version of this, as I said, is developed in a paper that was published in 2021. But with this, I'd like to conclude. I think the current state of public international law, my element 1 and my element 2, put together, recognize, or at least point in the direction of recognizing the existence of a right to flee. That should lead us to a fundamental rethink of the non-entrée paradigm, of the externalization measures and the pathways to international protection, which do not exist. We do not have any primary pathways to protection. So if I'm correct, the international community needs to move away from this discretion-based model of complementary pathways and start speaking about the need for primary pathways to international protection, respecting the rights-based paradigm that we live in if we take international human rights law seriously. And if this is true, then we need that we engage in mechanisms that allow safe and regular admission for the purposes of seeking asylum as a matter of legal right and legal obligation. Thank you very much for your attention, and as I said, if you're interested, these are the sources where the longer version of the argument has been developed. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Violetta, for this thesis presented with the strength, the dedication, the energy of the expert. And so I hope that we'll have still a time to afterwards to discuss a little bit about this. These positions that also from a dogmatic point of view are highly interesting. But now we pass on to Mariana Pace, and as we conclude this conference with a presentation by Mariana Pace, again we have here a collaborator of Professor Cataldi at the University of Napoli Orientale. Mariana Pace was, together with Anna Fazzini, a pillar of this project, and with some other collaborators, as they provided decisive assistance in an endeavor that was not easy to administer. At the same time, Mariana Pace is a dedicated young scholar concentrating on migration and asylum issues with a series of excellent publications in this field. Like Anna Fazzini, she's looking beyond traditional disciplinary borders, and today she will deal with the relations between migration and refugee law and the sustainable development goals. I think we can all learn from this important extension of the academic perspective in this research area. So we will listen with great attention to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor Ilpol. Good evening to all. Thank you to MAPS to give me the opportunity for my intervention. And
my presentation on migrants and refugees in sustainable development goal. In the short time that we have, I will try to demonstrate how states reporting on SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, in particular on migrants and refugees issues, is crucial in the challenge for sustainable migration and for a sustainable governance of migration. In the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, for the first time we have, contrary to the past experience in the Agenda for Sustainable Development, we have the recognized for the first time the contribution of migration to sustainable development. Migration is considered as a cross-cutting issue in agenda, relevant to all sustainable development goals. Further, SDG motto, to leave no one behind, is a clear call for sustainable development to be inclusive, including for migrants. At least 10 out of 17, I go, okay. No, la di prima. Io ce l'ho quella. Okay. At least we have 10 out of 17 goals contain target and indicators migrant related. That are directly relevant to migration, but also mobility in general. The inclusion of migration in agenda presents countries with a series of new migrants data, new migrant data challenges and reporting requirements. At the same time, this presents a crucial opportunity to improve migration data. What about migration and SDG? We have also 24 indicators that are relevant for disaggregation that we are, and I will speak about disaggregation in the second part, briefly. About migration related, we have targets that speak about immigration to health professional, scholarship to study abroad, right to labor migrants, trafficking, remittance, disaggregation of national data by migratory status. As regards the question of disaggregation, in order to not leave no one behind, require relevant SDG indicator to be disaggregated by migrant status. As regards target who are migration related, I left this slide as all can take a look on specific issues that we can find in the target and in the indicator. Why target and indicator are so important in the agenda in the new agenda, because we have we're talking about non-binding, non-legal binding instruments. We agenda is a soft law instrument, but with the reference to social law, economic law, but above all, agenda require to the states to the states are obliged to the respect of human rights law. So we have most of target and indicator that are strictly binding to human rights law. And this is the most important difference with the past, as regards as the sustainable development. What about migration in the SDG reporting framework? In the agenda includes multi-level follow-up mechanism to review progress on meeting the SDG. As the SDG are a country-owned process, the responsibility of SDG reporting lies with national government, because states are invited to present on voluntarily status national plan on implementation of agenda and plan on reviews of follow-up with regional, global and thematic reviews conduct to complement the process. To monitor SDG process in the interagency and expert group on SDG indicator develop a list of 2032 individual global indicators, including several referred to migration, as we have seen. Yes. As regards as the second question, the indicator relevant for disaggregation, that reflects a growing understanding that disaggregation data is an important way to ensure inclusiveness and prevent discrimination for specific population subgroups, including for migrants. Doing this is an opportunity to gain better data on migrant situation, to understand better their living condition, and to understand how migration impact on health, income, education, and other areas and issues. Disaggregation is necessarily in order to integrate migration as a cross-cutting theme across other sectors and other target, other goals. Satisfying reporting requirement for goal is challenging and can present a significant burden to government, in particular to National Statistical Office. The global level migration indicators are relatively underdeveloped, and currently this is the most challenge. At global level, most countries still do not report on migration SDG indicator or disaggregator other indicator by migration status. What about migration status? One moment. When we spoke about migratory status, we speak about the country of birth or citizenship. To be second generation, and other dimension, time of arrival, reason, internal and international migration. One moment. Okay. So, more action is needed to translate SDG data framework into results, improving migration data realities on the ground. There is a need for countries to develop their capacity to generate and report meaningful data on migration in the context of SDG. Effort must focus both on generating data for migration SDG indicator and disaggregation of other indicators, as well as boosting use of this data. Steps must be taken to improve abilities to collect and use data, to help policymakers devise evidence-based policy to tackle migration aspect of SDGs. Overall, this is a need to improve migration data locally, nationally, regionally, and internationally for SDG monitoring purpose. Improving migration data is a crucial step to improve migration governance. And SDG framework can help kickstart effort to do this. Thank you.
So many thanks for this presentation. I think we all see that the SDGs are becoming the dominant perspective under which we are addressing our societal problems. And I think from the viewpoint of migratory law, asylum issues, refugee law, it could really become a legitimatory additional force that could strengthen this discussion and give it even better political and legal foundation. And it's most valuable that you have contributed this perspective. So we are a little bit late in time, but we should nonetheless accept questions. I think we have a few minutes, and you have surely many questions to all these wonderful presentations of this afternoon session. But perhaps we concentrate on the essential. What is this essential? So everyone remains smooth, but the floor is open. Otherwise, we could ask the director of this project to come to the desk and perhaps to address the whole audience. Professor Cataldi, in many cases, prepared a final word for you. Yes, okay. Perhaps for the image, it's better if he's there.
So thank you very much. If there are no questions, and I imagine that many should have been done, but we are all tired after 2 days of work, and we deserve a little bit of distraction of natural light and so on. And so also my conclusions will be finalized in a couple, 2-3 minutes, because there is very little to conclude, as I think everything has been already said, and I congratulate myself because, you know, for the choice of the speakers and for the choice of the program. But I have to share this compliment also with Peter Hilpold, who was the main, with me was the main decisor concerning all the organization of the 2 days. Coming to the content, coming to the essential things that have been done and on which I just want to, like a sort of point, tell 2 words. First of all, the importance of having been highlighted the concept, the evolution, the significance of the concept of border. And really the difference between a bridge and a wall, and how the figures, and I refer in particular to the interesting intervention of Ettore Recchi, but also the others, my friend Giovanni Gozzini. All the first part this morning was devoted to the historical part, but also to these figures that show us how can I say, how different is the perception of the reality when we try to reason with the data that the practice offer. And also, may I quote the important thing that has been said by Espel Gid when she said, be careful on the instrumentalization of migrants in order to close the borders, in order to close the harbors. We have had this sad experience in Italy that she mentioned of the closure of harbors due to COVID-19. We were no more a safe place because of COVID. This is incredible because we did not close airports, we did not close, why we did close to migrants. So our migrants in difficulties are carrying COVID to Italy. So please. And also a second point I want to highlight is the rule of law and judiciary, which has been many times given attention by the speakers, to Professor Goodwin Gill, but also to by the others. And on this point, of course, yes, Professor Goodwin spoke, a little part of his speech was devoted to the important aspect of the national implementation of international instrument, which is really crucial. On this point, I want to add that on these instruments we have to develop more, how can I say, more discussion and more thoughts on the correspondence of these instruments to present reality, because it is not always like that. Sometimes we have instruments which are no more correspondent to reality, or for example, which are used with difficulties to reality. May I also think to the SOLAS Convention or the Hamburg Convention concerning the migration by sea, because of course they were thought for other situations, not for migrants in distress, and so there is a difficulty of implementation. But also sometimes it is the will of implement them which lacks. And so a sort of distortion, the use the law in order to violate the law. So legitimacy versus legality, and this often happens. And also in this, under this point, the issue of the value of customary law. Yesterday I posed a question to Professor Hathaway, and he was very, how can I say, negative on the possibility of considering, for example, some of the provisions of the Geneva Convention as applicable also to states which have not ratified the convention. He said that it was a sort of offense toward these states. I'm not insisted, of course, but may I add now, it's no more an offense to undermine the importance, for example, of the case law, of the courts of the same states which maybe do not have ratified these conventions. Because if we want to consider the state only for what consists its governmental representation, okay, is completely right. But if we want to open to the judiciary, to the practice, to everything which is represents the customary law, I think we should consider, and sometimes also the importance, for example, of the non-refoulement principle as customary law. Violetta, some minutes ago, poses this interesting perspective, the right to flee. Yes, of course, how cannot we agree with this perspective? The problem is, of course, that for the moment, what we have this right to migrate, which is a sort of general principle in the United in the Declaration on Human Rights, and also in the Covenant. But right to migrate where? Or to the moon, because there is not a correspondent, a parallel right to enter a territory, because it is still governed by, of course, national, domestic, implementation. So we hope that there will be a development in this from this point. Coming very briefly, and I close, to the European Union. It has been underlined by many speakers the necessity of changing the system, in particular of changing the Dublin system. A very modest, very not convincing answer is, in my opinion, the pact on migration, which has been proposed by the European Union Commission, which reiterates in a certain way, which repeats the concept of the first entry, and so the burden on the states which are the target of this question, and so on. So it should be really what we need. It should be really to try to have this general concept which are fixed in capital letter in the treaties, solidarity, human rights, but also this concept of vulnerability, which sometimes is developed by courts. In Italy, as elsewhere, we have a very interesting jurisprudence on the concept of vulnerability, which overcomes other difficulties coming from the text, in the sense that if a person is vulnerable, stop the research on the possibility of gaining some status ends. And also in this perspective, it's very interesting the case to which François Ferral made a reference of the French Constitutional Court, le Conseil constitutionnel. It is very interesting because it is the direct implementation of general concept which has to be with the effort. We have to rely on this capacity, on this possibility by judges to make this sort of efforts in the name of course, the general constitutional values. And so maybe with this very sad situation we have in Europe these days, we have had the proof that if there is the will, something can happen, because the activation for the first time of the directive on temporary protection means that it was possible maybe also some time ago in other cases of emergencies. It has not been done because there was not, what was lacking was the consent by the other, by the European Union states. So if it is possible, why do not reiterate this possibility? So maybe this should be an interesting signal also for the future. So I conclude thanking all of you for your participation, for your kindness, for your, of course, promise to deliver a written text very soon. Thank you very much. The end of July is the deadline. If someone needs some more hours, there is no problem. But a special thanks to all the teams of the 10 universities involved, to all the guests, to my team, to all the young professors, young researchers, which have been really the core of this initiative. Last sentence to migrants, because I always remember a sentence that I read on the border between California and Mexico in Tijuana. It is not us who cross the border, it's the border who crosses us. So maybe if we come back to this mentality, if we try, we are only modest, how can I say, people who make research and learning, but if we try to influence civil society and then maybe policymakers on this way of thinking, maybe things could go better. This is our task, and in my opinion, we have performed it in the best way during these 2 days. Thank you very much to all of you. Um, 8:30 p.m. to Antonio here in Via Partenope. Some of you already was there, not yesterday, but on Thursday, on Wednesday. Tonight we come back there, Antonio, for a soiree, a Neapolitan soiree with pizza, mozzarella, and so on. Okay.